So today we're going to cover the Equity Profile, which is a new tool offered by the FLPBS project. We're going to get everyone oriented to this tool. We're going to first, though, address the rationale for looking at equity in discipline, go over some equity basics for behavior data, and then we'll get into an overview of the basic measures and some potential next steps. You thought you guys were done with the poll. I have one more for you, assuming I can get it up here on my computer. All right. Let me know, please, how familiar are you with the Equity Profile tool? Not at all familiar, somewhat familiar, very familiar? I'd like to see where folks are at. Okay, so we have, by and large, the majority of folks are not at all familiar, and that is cool. That's the purpose of today's chat. Okay, awesome. Thank you for doing that, guys. All right, so then I'll take that information moving forward, and we'll show you guys the tool. So you guys might be aware, if you're at all familiar with the PBS project's outcome data, we're doing really good here in the state of Florida. What this graph is showing you is that for schools even that implement PBS with low levels of fidelity, which would be a benchmarks of quality score below 70, schools have been reducing their rates of out-of-school suspension. So these are average days of out-of-school suspension per 100 students. What we see on the right-hand side of the graph is that schools that implement PBS with high levels of fidelity, indicated by a benchmarks of quality score greater than or equal to 70, they have even fewer days of out-of-school suspension, which is awesome. We're so proud of you guys for continually improving year after year, even though we're adding more and more schools to the picture. However, some stuff has been happening over the last year that has caught our attention and made us think twice about those outcomes. Back in February, a little thing called the SHOT report was released, and you can access that full report through the hyperlink here on the slide. And what that report showed is that through publicly available data, Florida ranked first in the nation for suspension of black and white males, and third in the nation for suspension of Latino males. What they found drilling deeper into that report and deeper into that data is that there were some districts in Florida where the suspension rates for black males were as high as 40%. So as many as 40% of black males in some districts in Florida have been suspended. Go ahead and type into chat if that surprises anybody. Let me know. Let's have a little conversation around this. Excellent. Some folks are right on it. I love it. I'll give you guys a chance to respond. It certainly caught our attention. And this SHOT report was actually just one of two reports that came out in February that showed the exact same thing. Okay, so we have some folks are not surprised at all, some are very surprised. Okay. Well, just this past month in July, the U.S. Department of Education had another conference, and you can follow it with the hashtag Rethink Discipline. That's on Twitter. You can also Google Rethink Discipline, or you can follow the hyperlink right here on the slide, and you can see the announcement about this particular conference as well as all the resources that came out of that conference. And basically what this showed was exactly the same thing as the SHOT report, is that Florida, the more blue you have, the more students that have been suspended. So you can see this whole southeast portion of the country. There's a lot of blue districts in there. Also Alaska, but we won't go there. So we're seeing some consistent results in terms of the use of suspension, particularly with regards to African American or black males. I'm going to go ahead and use the term black. So black males and sometimes Hispanic males as well. Students who are American Indian also have very high rates of suspension pretty consistently. So that gave our project some pause, because you guys saw what good outcomes we had in our outcome data, and so we didn't really know what was going on. So we took a little bit of a closer look. So we're looking at an actual school's outcome data from year to year, and what this shows you in 2012-13, the events of in-school suspension, the days of in-school suspension, the events of out-of-school suspension, and the days of out-of-school suspension. And then it shows you that same information for the 2013-2014 school year. And so what we saw with this particular school is that from year to year, they had a 40% decrease in out-of-school suspension days, which is right in line with what we've been seeing statewide in terms of overall outcomes. When we looked at some of those other measures, they had a 31% decrease in OSS events, a decrease in ISS days, and a very small increase in ISS events. So overall, we were pretty happy with this school's results, but we didn't think that told the whole picture. So we went ahead and broke down those changes in OSS events and days by subgroup. So in this particular graph, what we're looking at is a restatement of the overall change in OSS days. And then we're looking at the change in out-of-school suspension for Black students and the change in out-of-school suspension for white students. And what this graph tells us is that white students with 1 year of PBS implementation, they experienced a greater decrease in out-of-school suspension days than did Black students, which might help to start to explain some of the inequity we're seeing in discipline outcomes. So what we're seeing in this particular example is that white students seem to get a little bit more benefit from the school's PBS efforts than Black students did. What we also envisioned is that some schools may have perfectly equitable outcomes with their PBS activities, but if they inherited a discrepancy in their discipline outcomes, then that could be maintained over time. So what we have here is just an example where a school before there was PBS, they had a certain number of OSS days per 100 students for Black students, for white students, and overall. And then after PBS implementation, they decreased exactly in half. They cut out-of-school suspension days in half for all subgroups, and that resulted in an overall decrease of 50% for all students. But because they inherited a discrepancy, there was still a discrepancy. So they still have disproportionate outcomes, even though the impact of their implementation was perfectly equitable. In fact, in this case, it was equal. So what we are learning as we dig into this data on a more regular basis is that PBIS can have a positive impact on outcomes overall for white and minority students, and there's also plenty of evidence, much of it in the research literature, showing that PBS implementation is effective for minority students, such as minority students in urban settings. But PBIS by itself is insufficient to eliminate disproportionate discipline. So something more is needed. And that's a little bit of what we're getting into today. Now, one of the big things that will be coming up this year, and you guys will be hearing more about this as the school year goes on, is that our PBS evaluations that we do at the end of the year will be changing this year. Last year, when you guys completed your outcome data summary, there was a second page on that outcome data summary with equity profile data. That was optional. And so if you had access to the number of students from each subgroup who were given an office referral or suspension, and or the total number of office referrals or suspensions given to students from each subgroup, then you could complete some of this equity profile data. And all of that was optional, even if you wanted to apply for model school status. Well, starting this school year, it will be a required part of PBS evaluations, because we're learning very clearly that if you're not looking specifically at this issue, then there's a very good chance you're going to miss it entirely. And that's kind of what is helping to perpetrate the inequities in educational outcomes we're seeing for different groups of students. So we're going to ask our PBS schools to take a specific look at this data, at least on an annual basis. Now, if you're watching this chat and you're a little bit concerned because you don't know what this data is or how to access it, then go ahead and use your support network. Let your PBS coach and or your district coordinator know if you're unable to access this kind of information, because then they can feed that information back up to the project and we can figure out what we need to do in response. So definitely open those lines of communication if you're concerned about getting this data. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get started in identifying whether disproportionality exists at your school. So for starters, I'm going to go back to the chat box. and ask you guys, define disproportionate. What do you think that means? What does disproportionate mean to you? Way to go, Dr. Charles. You're right on that. All right, Cheryl, good job. Way to go, guys. No equity. That's a nice, concise way of saying it. Not equal. Unequal. Very good. We saw a really cool little graphic about the difference between equality and equity not that long ago. That would have been nice to include here. But that's a topic for another day. Okay, so I'm seeing Diane's comment that based on membership rates, percentages are not aligned. So there's not a match there between membership and whatever outcome you're looking at. I can see that. And then I'm seeing with Cheryl, when you have a group of students based on your populations who have referrals which outnumber their population. Very nice. You guys got it. You definitely have the gist there. According to Merriam-Webster.com, disproportionate means that you're having or showing a difference that is not fair, reasonable, or expected. Or another way of thinking about that is that something is too large or too small in relation to something else. So we are all on the same page in terms of what is disproportionate. So let's talk a second about what's expected, since that's part of that definition. So if you start at the beginning, there really should be no difference in terms of discipline for students of different races or of disability status. There's nothing in the human genetic makeup that would determine children from one group are more likely to act out than children from another group. Even for students who have disabilities, even behavioral disabilities, the supports that they receive through their IEP are supposed to address their needs so that the likelihood of behavioral issues are about equal to that of their non-disabled peers. Nonetheless, we see differences. Many people assume that the effects of poverty are responsible for those intergroup differences. And just to be real clear, poverty does increase students' risk for poor behavioral outcomes. However, even among kids who are poor, there are still significant racial differences. In fact, studies have shown that even for the even for the poorest white students, outcomes for the poorest white students can exceed outcomes even for the most affluent Black students. If you have a copy of Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations, you can see his study explained right there in the very first chapter. What's even more surprising is that you can see racial differences even among kids with the same types of problem behavior, the same severity of problem behavior, and even with kids who have the same teacher ratings of problem behavior. So even when a teacher identifies a kid as having a certain level of problem behavior, you're still seeing differences based on race. Now, if that interests you, there's a link down here at the bottom of the PowerPoint, and that takes you to Russ Skiba's latest research summary. The whole Discipline Disparities series is really helpful and contains pretty current information. So if you wanted to Google Discipline Disparities series, and you can include the terms the Equity Project, then you should find his materials real quick. The U.S. Department of Education also links to his research, his and his partner's research, I should say. So even though race may be a difficult topic to talk about, it's something that we do need to learn how to address. So I'm going to put a poll up here for you, and let me see just what you guys think. So knowing that we have all these disproportionate outcomes, let's say at your school you have very few Black students who are enrolled at your school. So if that were the case, true or false, would you need to worry about disproportionate discipline? So the way this is worded is, if there are very few Black students at my school, I won't need to worry about disproportionate discipline. So I'm seeing responses from 12 of our 16 folks, 13 of our 16 folks. Excellent. I'm seeing someone respond through the chat area. Okay. And you guys got it right. So if there are very few Black students at my school, you will need to worry about disproportionate discipline. And in some cases, the numbers around disproportionate discipline can look even more extreme when there are fewer students enrolled in the school. So very good. You passed that first one. All right. So let's look at some of those differences in discipline outcomes. So for one, pretty robust findings, things that are very much expected when we look at equity data. We see that discipline outcomes for Black and American Indian students, the rate of suspension and expulsion nationwide is more than twice their rate of enrollment. Sometimes you see it as high as 3, 3.5, 4 times. Kind of depends on which year and what outcome you're looking at. Students with disabilities, which we abbreviate with SWD here, students with disabilities are more than twice as likely to be suspended than their non-disabled peers. And remember, if you're a student with a disability, you are receiving supports that are supposed to help compensate for that disability. So those supports should make you about as likely as your non-disabled peers to have to contact the discipline system. So those are very robust findings. Those are things that when we don't see them in a school, it's actually pretty surprising, and we really want to find out what that school is doing to account for the equity in their outcomes. Now, some areas where there are some mixed findings or there's less data. Data around Hispanic students is a bit mixed. Sometimes Hispanic students have disproportionate discipline outcomes. Other times they don't. The US OCR data snapshot, the hyperlink that you see down here at the bottom of the slide, that one actually shows that Hispanic students that are not identified as English language learners, they are at risk, but Hispanic students who are English language learners are not at risk, which is interesting. There's also some emerging data around students who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or questioning. There is some data around students who are multiracial and or Pacific Islander. But these students are usually not a very large percent of the population, and it's been difficult for districts and schools to crunch that kind of data. But there's some data out there, but it's less consistent. Another reason that we have to start paying attention to this issue is that last fall, for the first time, the total number of Latino, Black, and Asian students in public education was expected to surpass the number of white students enrolled in public education. So our minority student population is growing, and it's expected to continue doing so. So this issue will impact many more schools in the years to come. There's also this whole thing here about multi-tiered systems of supports that we're supposed to be doing in Florida. And right there in the first sentence of the definition is that our job is to ensure successful education outcomes for all students, not just the ones that are easy to identify. But everyone needs to be succeeding. And with behavior, we look at discipline outcomes as one measure of that success. And if that weren't enough, then we've got the Florida Department of Education weighing in on the issue, and they have a couple of state performance indicators directly related to minority achievement. So they're looking at percentage of students scoring at or above grade level on English language arts, science, and math by subgroup. Then we're also looking at graduation rates by subgroup. So these are important outcomes for the entire state. So what are some basics that we need to address when we're looking at behavior data? Now, equity metrics for behavior data can be a little bit tricky because behavior data changes on a daily basis, especially if you're using something like office discipline referrals. Depending on your school, those might change on an hourly basis. And depending on the number of kids involved, that can have a big impact in terms of how your equity looks. So keep that in mind as you're looking at your behavior data, that it changes daily. A golden rule of thumb here is that multiple measures must be used. If you're only looking at one equity metric, you're going to miss a big part of the picture. And you guys will start to see that as we play with some different kinds of data during our chat here. And then, in case you were not aware, small numbers can have a big impact on the way that you interpret your finding. Now there's a little bullet here about save rounding for your last step. If you're doing this stuff by hand, that's important to know. If you're using our Excel template, it does it for you, so don't worry about that. But the thing to focus on and really understand right up front is understanding about small numbers. So if we have a small number of students enrolled in the school, or a small number of students who contact the discipline system, just 1 or 2 students can have a big impact on your interpretation of the data. So in this particular example, we're going to look at 3 American Indian students enrolled at this school, and 2 of those students received 1 referral apiece. And what that looks like in your equity summary is that 2 out of 3 American Indian students received at least 1 referral. Wow, that seems like a large percent. And considering that group, it kind of is. But we are only talking about a couple of kids with 1 referral apiece. Now similarly, if you do not write a lot of referrals or suspensions, then a small number of referrals or suspensions will also work against you. So before we talked about a small number of students, so now we're going to talk about a larger number of students, but a small number of referrals. There's only 4 referrals across all 3 student groups. And what we're seeing here is that in this situation, if you have 1 student from one group receive a couple of the referrals, then it's going to make it look as if that one group received a vastly disproportionate amount of those referrals. And technically, they did. But the way that you intervene with that problem may vary depending on the number of students involved and the capacity of your school. So in this particular case, we highlighted mentoring and check-in, check-out as possible alternatives, although that would certainly depend on the type of problem going on at the school. So small numbers can have a big impact. Keep that in mind. Another thing that will really help out as you look at this data is looking at some of those decision rules. Now, when our project talks about decision rules, these are predetermined guidelines for deciding when a problem exists and or how we will intervene. What that does is it prevents your team from getting bogged down in trying to figure out the data and talking about specifics in the data. It makes it a lot easier. If you set a flag of 1.5 or higher, then you just look for those 1.5s and higher and deal with what comes out. So it's a big time saver. But with equity data, there are no hard and fast decision rules or cutoffs for when it's time to intervene. The state of Florida considers risk ratios of 3.0 or higher for students with disabilities receiving more than 10 days suspension. They consider that a red flag. But in terms of looking at discipline outcomes for all students, that's a very small percentage of kids who contact the discipline system. And 3.0, by the way, that means 3 times higher risk than all other kids. That's a pretty high flag. And so your school, your district, or your community and families, they may feel that that's too high of a level and they want you to take action sooner. So that is definitely something to consider, is working with your stakeholders and deciding what level of risk is time to take action. The National PBIS Technical Assistance Center, they also published some guidelines, or some suggestions, I should say. So they suggested looking at prior years' data, and if you're exceeding what your prior years were, then that's a flag for taking action. They might suggest looking at local or national norms, your capacity or some kind of logical criteria. And some advocacy groups have recommended a risk ratio of 1.25 or higher, which would suggest a 25% higher risk. And so in that case, it may not be that your school says we have a huge problem and we have to really shake things up. It may be that if you have a risk ratio of 1.26, then your school takes a closer look to see what that problem really looks like. So those are some different guidelines that are out there. If you'd like more information on that, you can look at the PBIS Data Guide for more detail. So those are some basics as you get into the equity template. Now when you download that template, you just have to fill in 3 pieces of information. The number of students enrolled in the school. If you're looking at referrals, you'll then enter the number of students for each subgroup who received a referral, and then the total number of referrals given to students of that subgroup. And our latest version of the equity template, it has a tab for race ethnicity with referrals. It has a tab for race ethnicity with race ethnicity with out-of-school suspension, and then tabs for ESE versus general ed for referrals and suspension as well. So depending what is called for in each of those examples, you just fill in those cells. So one thing that we discovered this year is that that question by itself can be a little bit confusing. So I'm going to go back to the chat pod here. I'm going to ask you guys to type in your answer. Identify the appropriate demographic category or categories for a student with a disability who is white, black, and Asian. So if this student received a suspension and you wanted to tally that student's suspension, what demographic category or categories would you place that student in? Way to go, Allison, you were right on that question. Okay, I'm seeing some good answers here. Multiple categories came from Collier. Yes. Multiracial, yes. Yep, that student would go into multiple categories. Hey, Cheryl, there you go. Look at that. Students with disabilities and multiracial. That is the formal response I was looking for. You nailed it. That's right. A student with a disability gets counted as a student with a disability. That student who has a disability is also multiracial. And so that student would go into that category as well. They do not have to equal 100% because we're looking at different categories here. Let's try one more example. What category would you count a Hispanic student who is also American Indian? You guys are right on this. I love it. All right. I'm seeing some consensus, it looks like. So that student who is Hispanic and American Indian would be counted as Hispanic. That's exactly right. So there have been some questions about Hispanic students who also have a race, because students are required to identify both ethnicity as well as race. But in terms of reporting that data back or counting that data up to see what your school's profile looks like, once a student identifies him or herself as Hispanic, then you should ignore the rest. Unless that student has a disability, in which case that student would also be counted as having a disability. And so that comes from the federal guidelines. And so they basically said exactly what I just said, where Hispanic equals Hispanic, multiple races equals multiracial, and students with disabilities are reported in addition to race. So hopefully that's making sense for folks. You guys were right on it in the chat. Go ahead and type into chat if you have questions as we go along. So as we look at each of these different equity measures, we're going to use a couple of different examples, a really easy one and then a pretty easy one. And this is what the completed example for our pretty easy example looks like. And so what this is that this particular example, we have a pretty even distribution of students who are Hispanic, Black, multiracial, and white. And then we have a smaller percentage of the student body who is American Indian, Asian, and Native Hawaiian. So we like those big round numbers. But once you can enter in the enrollment information, the number of students who contacted discipline, and the number of discipline events given to students from that group, then everything after that calculates automatically. And if you have a copy of our Excel template, if you look down the screen, you'll actually get statements, written statements, to help you interpret what those different numbers mean. If you are having trouble accessing the equity profile, go ahead and type into chat. Stephanie is standing by. She can provide the link and help you navigate so that you can download a version for your own use. Okay, so those common metrics that we're going to go over are the risk ratio, student composition, and referral composition, also sometimes called comparison reports. We have a handy-dandy summary in the file share pod in the lower left-hand corner of the screen. It's called the Equity Metrics Handout. If you'd like to download a copy of that, then you'll have copies of these PowerPoint slides along with a little bit of written guidance. So the first one we'll go over is risk. And simply put, that is just the percentage of a group that is affected by whatever it is you're studying. Okay, so that's pretty simple. In our really, really easy example, let's consider a school where we have 10 Black students who are enrolled in a school. And of those 10 Black students, 5 Black students receive at least one referral. Then the risk for Black students at this school would be the number of Black students who received at least one referral divided by the number of Black students enrolled in the school, 5 divided by 10, or 50%. So in this really easy example, the risk for black students is 50%. The question is that a good number or a bad number? And many times with risk, it's hard to tell. And I forgot that my next slide is our second example of risk, where we're looking at our easy example. So here, in this particular example, where we had 50 black students enrolled, 40 received a referral. For a total of 120 referrals given to black students at this example, the risk here was 80%. So this is an example where you can look at risk and you might be really surprised and astounded by what you see there, and it might be clear that that's something you want to pay attention to. However, that's not always the case. Risk by itself can be very hard to interpret in terms of, is this something I need to deal with, pay attention to, or make different? So for that next level of analysis, you can use the risk ratio, and that's comparing the risk for one group of students to the risk for all other students. And ideally, you want the risk ratio to be equal. You want the risk for all groups of students to be equal. That's what we're aiming for. So with the risk ratio, you had to decide who your comparison group will be. The USDOE, the OSEP Technical Assistance Center, they say that they would prefer for you to compare a particular target group with all other kids. That's their guidance. I kind of like it. It allows you to calculate a risk ratio in very diverse settings. So that's the group that's used in the equity profile that we offer. With the risk ratio, keep in mind that you need to have at least 15 students in both the target group and in the comparison group in order for that risk ratio to be stable and somewhat meaningful. So practically, if you're using the equity profile and you see a risk ratio that's higher than 7.0, double check the group size, because that is one sign that there are fewer than 15 kids. Sometimes, though, that can be a true result. It just means that you need to double check. Also, please keep in mind that risk ratios can change a great deal in time, or a great deal in very short periods of time. So your risk ratio in October may bear little to no resemblance to your risk ratio at the end of the year. That's pretty normal, and that's why we look at more than one equity metric when we're assessing disproportionate discipline. So risk ratio sounds a little bit fancy, but it is pretty simple in concept. We go back to that idea about risk, and we learned how to calculate risk for a target group of students. Then the next step is to calculate the risk for our comparison group, which is all other students. And in our super easy example, we have 10 students that are black, white, and Hispanic. So what that becomes, as soon as the animation is done here, is we have 10 African American students in the school, 5 of whom have at least one referral, and we have 20 all other students, 10 of whom have at least one referral. So we put that together, we figure out the risk for African American students, and divide by the risk for all other students. And in our super easy example, that works out to a 50% risk for black students, divided by a 50% risk for all other students, which works out to 1.1. And if that's the case, that means that those groups of students have an exactly equal risk of whatever outcome it is we were looking at. And that's phenomenal. And that's also something that your school or district will probably never find. But that's to be expected. That's part of what makes having those decision rules up front a really handy thing to do. But the way that you read it is you look at the decimal values involved and numbers greater than 1. So a 1.25 suggests a 25% higher risk. A 1.5 is a 50% higher risk. 2.5 is a 2.5 times greater risk, etc., right on up until you get into the yikes territory and beyond. In our next example, what we see with the risk ratio, we had found a risk of 80% for black students, and when we compared the black students' risk to the risk for all other kids, what we saw is that the risk ratio was 1.57. So their risk was increased compared to all other kids, but it wasn't into yikes territory. That was a bit surprising. Hang on, folks, I just had a notice that my computer wanted to restart, so I want to make sure I'm delaying that. All right, thank you. So then in our pretend example, black students had a 57% higher risk than all other students of receiving a referral, even though 80% of all black students had gotten a referral. What do you guys think might be going on in this particular situation? If a lot of black students are receiving referrals, but their risk compared to all other kids is elevated, but not off the charts. Way to go, Collier. Way to go, Cheryl. You guys are right on it. Lots of kids are getting just one. I'd like to see Cheryl's response. There's a large number of students receiving a referral. That's right. We don't know if they're getting just one or if they're getting multiple. But yeah, this might be a situation where lots of kids in that school are getting referrals. So then, even though lots of black kids are receiving referrals, they're kind of like everybody else in that school. So that's a good thing to pay attention to. I see Dr. Charles is typing, so I don't want to go too fast. Yes, you got it. So more students are receiving at least one referral. That is a good sign of what might be going on. Okay, so then the next thing that you might want to logically look at would be the student composition. And this is where we shift our lens just a little bit. And here we look only at kids who received a referral. So this green part of the circle that we're looking at, these are all kids in the school who received a referral. And we want to find out what percent belong to our target group, which in the examples we've been using are black students. So with composition, we had started with risk, but we're going to get rid of kids who had not received any referrals. And we're just going to focus on kids who have referrals. So of kids who have referrals, 5 are black. And so we just calculate a quick percentage. 5 out of those 15 kids are black, which means that the student composition in this example, 33% of students who receive referrals are black. Now to make some meaning out of that, again, sometimes that can make sense all by itself, but frequently you have to compare the student composition to that group's percent of the student body to see if it's higher or lower than expected. If it's lower than expected, we typically don't pay much attention to it because this is discipline data, and if a kid or a group of kids is not contacting the discipline system that much, generally we're happy about that. But if it's higher than expected, then they're making up a higher percentage of kids who receive referrals than you would predict, given the representation in the student body. So you usually had to compare student composition to enrollment in order to make meaning out of that particular metric. In our second example that we've been working here, we have a student composition of 30.3%. And in that second example, black students only made up 21% of the student body. So you can see that things are a little bit out of whack. Black students are overrepresented among students who receive referrals. Excuse me. Another point to notice is that the student composition cell in that equity profile turned red, as did the one below it, which is pretty cool because what we have going on in the background is something called the E formula. Now if you're an if you excel at Excel, then you may know how to unhide columns of data. Now, if that's the case, you can unprotect your equity profile and you can highlight some columns and unhide those columns, and you'll see some additional measures that have been running in the background. A couple of them are newer measures that we're trying to see if they actually make sense for folks, but the other one, the E formula, has a statistical way of seeing is the student composition for a particular group of students, is that higher than you would expect it to be given the number of kids enrolled in the school and the number of kids receiving discipline. So those cells turned red in our second example here, so that suggests that black students and multiracial students, their student composition is higher than expected given their enrollment. That E formula, or the red color, is particularly important when you're dealing with small student groups. So in this case, American Indian students, we'd want to see if the cell turns red for them. Same thing for Asian or Native Hawaiian students. So where the risk ratio fails, this E formula that runs in the background, that will pick up and cover the difference. So if you're using the equity profile, and you've typed in all the numbers and your student composition calculates and it does not turn red, then that means that your student composition is within expected bounds. That's a good thing. If it exceeds the expected bounds, that means it's too high and it'll turn red. Okay, so one thing that comes up all the time when we're looking at discipline data is frequent flyer students. And these students are frequently blamed, saying that they are responsible for the school's discipline data as a whole. When we're looking at equity metrics, that's not the case. The three measures that we just looked at, risk ratio, and student composition, they are not impacted whatsoever by students who receive multiple referrals. So that's really important to take away. Those first three measures are not impacted at all by students who receive multiple referrals. A measure that is impacted a great deal by students who receive multiple referrals are those referral comparison reports. So we're going to look at those next. With referral composition or referral comparison, depending how you want to look at it, you're looking at the percentage of referrals that were given to students of a particular group. So you can see how if a student from a particular group earns many referrals, they will have a big impact on the total number of referrals for their group. And that's exactly what we're seeing in this example. So we pull out all the referrals. We have 30 referrals, 9 were given to black students, and we don't care how many students are involved, we're just looking at referrals at this point. So we do a simple percentage. Number of referrals given to African American students divided by the total number of referrals comes to 30%. And then typically we need to compare that to the student enrollment in order for that to make any sense. So in our super easy example, we actually see that the percent of referrals given to black students was lower than expected, given their percent of the student body, which is a good thing. In our other example, the referral composition is that very last column there, and we can see that black students received almost 42% of this school's referrals, but they only made up about 22% of the student body. So that's almost double what you would expect given their percentage of the student body. So in sum, in the second example, what we see is that 80% of all black students receive a referral. Their risk is higher than the risk for all other students, and black students are overrepresented in student and in referral composition. Collier, I see your question, will the referral composition highlight as well? And unfortunately, it will not. I don't understand statistics well enough to know why, but you can have many referrals per kid. So I would expect that the degree of variance that you can have with referrals is probably too big for that E formula to have a lot of meaning in this particular circumstance. With kids, though, I guess it's a little bit easier to calculate. So the E formula will turn red for student composition, but not for referral composition. Great question. Okay, so I'm going to pause for just a second here. Do you guys have questions or concerns over anything we just talked about? I'll give you a second. Excellent, Cheryl. I see you joining in. While you guys are typing, I will point out that in that file share pod, there is a little file named FLPBS Chat Equity Profile Examples. I would suggest you can download that because we're going to try a couple of new examples with more complex data and see how you guys do with that. If you download those files, you get all the verbal statements that you get when you use the Equity Profile Excel template. Okay, I'm seeing Cheryl's question first. When we review the data, should we take out 6th grade data? That's a very interesting question. And I would say if you're using your discipline data, if you're looking at last year's data, go ahead and look at those 6th grade Well, actually, Cheryl, I need to clarify. Are you from a middle school or an elementary school that includes 6th graders? Elementary school with the 6th grade. Very good. Okay, thank you. That's where I thought you were coming from, but I realize that's an important distinction. So if that's the case, do you take out your highest grade level for the school? And I would say if you're starting this fall and you're looking at your equity metrics for last year's data, go ahead and leave your highest grade in that data. And then that way you can see for this year, if referrals with 6th graders were disproportionate, then you can use that data proactively to try to prevent those patterns from occurring again this year. Let me know if that makes sense or if that just seems really, really mucky and cloudy, because sometimes I do that. I can see you typing there. Okay, while you're typing, Cheryl, I'm going to look at Allison's question. Would it be appropriate to look at the individual referrals to determine if there is a pattern in the type of referrals, or is that on another report? That is a great question, Allison. I'm so glad you asked that. I think overall educators do have a tendency to want to go straight to the individual referrals and try to analyze them on a kid-by-kid basis. And I would argue that for Tier 1, and sometimes even in Tier 2, try to refrain from doing that. Look overall at patterns of data. There is another level of problem identification that happens once you've identified whether or not you have disproportionate discipline. So we'll allude to that, and we're going to spend more time throughout the year talking about that step. But I wouldn't necessarily go on a kid-by-kid basis. The exception to that is literally if you have 1 or 2 students enrolled in the school and both of those students received some sort of discipline, then that might make an argument. That's a small enough number where you can look in and see the details to see how you can be more proactive or preventative this year. Excuse me. But in cases where you have larger groups of students, then I would continue looking at patterns that are true for the majority of students in that group. Okay, Cheryl, I see your feedback there. Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, so let's look at that first example. And what I've done here is we're looking at office discipline referrals for race and ethnicity. And I did a little fancy cutting and pasting, and I took the second tab looking at students with disabilities, and I added them here so we can look at all the main demographic groups all together. So in this particular example, what we're seeing is that black students make up the majority of the student body. All the other student groups make up a much smaller percentage of the student body. Students with disabilities probably make up the next largest group at just 16.8% of the student body. So that gives you a sense of what the school looks like. So given that, which groups would you say have overrepresentation in referral data? Go ahead and type your answers into chat. Which groups in this example are overrepresented? Alessandra jumped right in there. Good job. So Alessandra, you identified students who are black and students who are Asian. Yep, and I'm seeing that come up from a number of different people. So students who are Asian, we're seeing 100% of those kids have received a referral. There's only 1 kid in the school, but they are overrepresented. With black students, about 37% of black students received a referral, and that represents a pretty large number of kids. And students with disabilities. Excellent, Cheryl. Now, how come you included students with disabilities in your answer, if you don't mind me asking? And if you don't want to say, just tell me no, and I will back off. But I'm very interested by your response. So we're looking here at students with disabilities. 94 students enrolled in the school, 33 received a referral. Total of 119 referrals given to that group. 35% of students with disabilities received a referral. Risk ratio of 1.0, student comp, and referral comp. Okay, and Cheryl says total students was 94, and 35% of those kids received a referral, and that seems high to you. And I think that is very valid. And if you look at the risk for kids who have an IEP and the risk for kids who are Black, that's awfully similar. That's a little surprising. So yes, I definitely see where you're coming from with that. So what I would say is, in this particular example, there is no exact right answer. This is where you go back with your stakeholders and you identify the groups that you would intervene with and why you might intervene with those groups. So certainly seeing that more than 1 out of every 3 students with a disability contacts a discipline system, that is a little concerning. I'd be wondering about our Tier 3 supports if that were the case. Here, having more than 1 out of 3 Black students receive a referral is pretty concerning to me. I'm seeing that even though Black students make up a big chunk of our student body, they have a higher risk of referral than all other kids. And we're not thinking about ESE status at this point. We're also seeing that their student composition is higher than the percent of the student body, and the cell turned red, so it's higher than we would expect given fancy statistical procedures. So I'm seeing in the chat box here, but the risk ratio is saying it's an equal number. So we're talking here about students with disabilities. Yes, I definitely got what you're saying. So in this case, what that shows is that students with disabilities had a 10% higher risk than all other kids of receiving a referral. So technically, you can find groups that have higher risk, but I can also understand where the risk value all by itself is cause for concern. So if your school was able to, then that might be something that you think about. You might have separate work groups that can divide up and tackle these 2 different issues. But I think for me, if we were really getting down to not having resources and having to be really lethal with our time, I might go for a group with a higher risk, unless my stakeholders told me different. Let's look at that second example. So here, we're looking at a different school, and we're looking at suspension events instead of referrals. And so what we see in this particular example is that the majority of the student body is white. Black students make up a very small percentage of the student body. Hispanic students probably have the second largest percent of the student body in terms of enrollment, followed by students with an IEP. So given the equity metrics in this example, which groups do you think have disproportionately few groups? Black students, multiracial students, and students with disabilities. And I'm definitely seeing a lot of consensus here. Excellent. That's kind of what I was hoping for. You guys are definitely picking up on some good themes. What we're seeing here is the risk for some of these groups is considerably higher than risk for other groups. The risk ratio supports that. The thing that I wanted to make sure you guys caught here is the total number of Black students who received an out-of-school suspension was just 8. So just 8 students, 8 Black students received an out-of-school suspension. So what that could mean is that the risk ratio for Black students is misleadingly high. That's what that could mean. Now, with students with disabilities, 25 students received an OSS, so this risk ratio is probably reliable. That meets the 15 student cutoff. So that's something to consider. Now, even though the number of Black students receiving an OSS was just 8, the student composition turned red. So that E formula tells us that those 8 students was more students than expected, given the number of students involved. I see folks are typing. I know we're running close on time. Aha, the 10 days rule for ESE. That could be. No more than 10 days suspension if a student has a disability. Then you need to do that manifestation determination. I love all this chatting. I'm going to let you guys keep going. Okay, excellent. Yes, 15 students is a good cutoff for the risk ratio. And that's thanks to, I think, Tim Bulmer from OSEP. It definitely wasn't me. But he knows stats. So we have a question. It says that 70% of white students received a suspension, but it's still in sync with the ratio. So let's see here. That is very close. What the student composition tells you is that 70% of students who received a suspension were white. So this looks just at kids who got a suspension. 70% of kids who got a suspension were white. And because white students make up 83% of the student body, that's actually a little bit lower than we would expect. Dr. Charles, would students who are black be factored into students with disabilities? Yes, they are. So students with disabilities also include students who are black. That's exactly right. And what the research tells us nationally is that if you are black and you have a disability, then you have especially high risk of experiencing disproportionate discipline. So that's a really good question. That is why on the equity profile there is a separate tab for race ethnicity and a separate tab for ESE versus Gen Ed because the number of students would be the same. A little bit confusing, but you're right. This number here for students who received an OSS, that includes students who are black, Hispanic, white, multiracial, etc., etc. Okay, because we are short on time, I'm going to go ahead and fast forward to a couple key ideas here. Once you've identified a group has disproportionate outcomes, then you want to do two things. One is identify if there are patterns that are true for the majority of students in that group. And so if you can identify those patterns, that will help you identify the types of problems that are going on at your school. If the patterns for your target group, if there's nothing that's true for at least half of the students in that target group, then you might want to consider why that is the case. So it's very possible that, for example, black students may receive disproportionately high rates of suspension, but you cannot pinpoint a specific location, time of day, problem behavior, or anything that's true for the majority of black students receiving suspension. So then the question becomes, well, really, what's going on? Why are the behaviors so variable? Why are the problem locations so variable? And you put that into the problem-solving model. If you are able to identify patterns that are true for the majority of kids in your target group, then your next step is to compare the patterns for your target group to the patterns of all other students in the school. And the reason you do that is to answer the question of whether your Tier 1 system met the needs of your target group. So if your black students have a disproportionately high amount of suspension, but their problems are the same as everyone else, then the issue that you're problem solving is why, for the same problems, are black students receiving more suspension? Versus if your black students had patterns of problem behavior that were unique to all other kids in your school, then it could very well be that whatever you were doing at Tier 1 to teach expected behaviors, to reward appropriate behaviors, and to consequate behaviors, maybe it just didn't cover the issues that were faced by students who were black. So the next step in problem solving is to define what that problem looks like for your target group students at your school. From there, you use that problem solving process to figure out what's going on, what to do about it. Our project is rolling out some materials around effective problem analysis for disproportionate discipline, and it revolves around these different domains. If you guys are familiar with the problem-solving process in Florida, we used to talk about ISIL for school-wide problem solving. We're changing those acronyms a little bit to help folks come up with hypotheses that are based in the research literature. So these are things that the research literature tells us are likely to contribute to disproportionate discipline. And so we help district teams and school teams come up with hypotheses related to these variables. So schools can change curriculum and instructional practices. They can change staff awareness, student-teacher relationships, their environment, and their discipline procedures. So we come up with hypotheses around those areas. We do what the U.S. Department of Ed is calling a root cause analysis to figure out what really is going on. Oh, thank you, Alessandra. That's right, the acronym. That way, so when you solve disproportionate discipline at your schools, you can say it was because you cared. That was the whole point. Anyways, haha, that's our little joke. But if you click on this link here, you can check out the USDOE's Action Planning Guide for Disproportionate Discipline. And it is chock full of resources. And you can rest assured that what they're talking about at the federal level is the same stuff that we're teaching here in Florida. It was actually extremely exciting to see that happen. What the federal government is saying is that ultimately your plans should address your school or district's level of readiness and capacity for making changes. And the strategies featured in your action plan to address disproportionate discipline will depend on what is feasible and which root causes you can modify. So that's a big deal. So there is no one silver bullet for disproportionate discipline. There's no one easy answer for what to do next. Some broad guidelines that are being shared about incorporating stakeholder values, make them active partners in addressing this problem, and make sure that their voices are represented in your Tier 1, Tier 2 systems. Building relationships, teaching practice and rewarding expected behaviors, avoiding cookie-cutter discipline matrices, and keeping yourself informed about what's going on. The PBS project is going to help with that last bullet about staying informed, and what we have planned for the rest of this fall is a chat series focused on those cared hypothesis domains. So the next one we have coming up will be Friday, September 25th, where we'll be talking about curriculum and instructional variables that are related to disproportionate discipline. If you'd like a copy of these dates, there's a file in the file share pod called Cared Series Dates. If you download that, it gives you a little one-page printout with the dates and the topics. Those will also be posted on the PBS website, so you can access those at any time. And a point of clarification, these are in addition to the PBS project's regular monthly chats. Also, if you haven't accessed it yet, you can access some resources on disproportionality on our Model Schools webpage. Once you get to that Model School page, just go ahead and scroll on down until you see the beige box. Then you know some cool stuff is going to be happening. The resources are located down below the beige box. You can also access the IDEA data guide. If you really love those numbers that we've been using, they all came from this particular resource. The PBIS Practice Guide, that's easy to get to if you go to www.pbis.org. Right there on their homepage, one of the first areas you can click on is Equity and PBIS, and you can find the National Center's recommendations there. Don't forget, our next PBS project regular chat will be on Thursday, September 24th. That's the day before our first cared chat. It's going to be on staff buy-in, so getting your staff bought into what you're doing with PBS. Thursday, September 24th at 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. And there's our contact information. Thank you guys for hanging in there with us as we made it through today's topic. I will hang out here in the room. If you have questions, I'm happy to address them. And then also, if you have time, I'm going to pull up a chat pod real quick. You can let us know how helpful was today's chat. I'm just going to put that up there for you. Thank you guys for participating and being active participants. Makes it a lot more fun. Have a great start